So this is a lot more provisional and improvisatory than you might expect. And in addition, I had set a really lovely, leisurely set of days aside not too long ago that I'd cleared out, and I was going to sit down and really meditate on suffering well. And that time ended up being given over completely to a very different kind of prepping when I and many people I know turned our time over to community organizing for mutual aid in the disability community, responding to the wildfires and power outages, and the fight for what we began to call #Power to Live last week. This is a slide from Power to Live. You can see the link up there to donate if you would like to. It's an ongoing struggle where I live as well as where you live. And in this slide there are two people, a fat activist and a kind of light-skinned with some kind of breathing apparatus, a BiPAP maybe, and a darker skinned person in a power wheelchair, and the slogan says, "We need #Power to Live." So I am, and we are thinking of suffering today under more stress than usual, I would say. I am, and in a sense, under duress. In a talk this summer at a symposium in England on humanity under duress, Ian Wilkinson explored how several famous thinkers understand the problem of suffering. So for instance, this is a little section on Karl Marx, where Wilkinson says, Marx appears to argue that, it's in bold there, suffering operates both to disable and to enable class consciousness, but he does not offer us any guidance when it comes to understanding how destructive and painful experiences that work to enforce and consolidate human alienation might be transfigured so that they operate to release our, quote, essential powers and human potential. In the last few weeks, I'm going to put pressure on the words, the disabling and enabling operations of suffering and the literal question of suffering's relation to power have been very fresh for me. Wilkinson called his talk, "The Sociological Problem of Suffering, Ever More Exacerbated and Confounding." Such a British title. And I'm really grateful for this opportunity to explore some questions that have been confounding me with you in the context of the history of the field called disability studies, my history of the field, which is now over 25 years of work in it. And I said to Jim and Makanani this afternoon that I had a vague sense of this talk that it was like, okay, boomer. So I'm definitely going to be just drawing on my long time in this field. And also, I'm really interested in this context, your collective work on the topic of suffering. I feel like I really need this more now than ever. So, oops, I'll just back up for a minute. For many disabled people, the tragedy view of disability is itself disabling. That's from John Swain and Sally French in 2004. The tragedy view is itself disabling. Now, critiques like that of the close relation between disability and tragedy have long been staple features of activist disability culture and of what gets called disability pride. A similar line of thinking has extended to associations of disability with suffering and to associations of the disability rights movement and of mainstream disability culture and of the academic field called disability studies with the disclaiming of suffering in the name of flourishing or pride or other words that might be used. But in a variety of recent contexts and under a variety of names. So for instance, and we can talk about any more of these later if you want to, the disability justice movement, crip theory, disability critical race theory, post-colonial analyses of the right to maim and of debility, and also in emerging memoirs that stage themselves somehow as post-disability studies, very explicitly. In all these things, disability culture is understood as itself disabling. in its denial of individual and systemic suffering. So what I want to do is do a little historical survey and look back to moments in these, and I really want to stress this, really necessary critiques that are emerging that caricature the development of disability studies as they make their cases, and also caricature the development of the disability rights movement that disability studies emerged out of. So I want to explore some counterexamples of ways in which disability studies historically and transnationally has suffered well, confronting what the disability legal historian Rabia Belt calls the import of suffering. So suffering, as the existence of this seminar suggests, is definitely a word for our moment. I'm going to take my definition of the term from Lauren Berlant. She always appeals. This is from Lauren Berlant's recent review, very recent, of Anne Boyer's memoir, The Undying: Pain, Vulnerability. Oh, I don't have this written down on the side, but listen to this amazing title if you haven't heard it already. Anne Boyer's title, The Undying: Pain, Vulnerability, Morality, Medicine, Art, Time, Dreams, Data, Exhaustion, Cancer, and Care. And it's a great book. This is a great review. Berlant's review is subtitled, Anne Boyer's Cancer Memoir Insists on the Commons of Suffering. And at one point, she's describing Boyer's book and also the books that Boyer draws on in this way. She says there, text that takes seriously, and then you can see this on the screen, the sense of suffering as an event of the body breaking in a specific social scene. Suffering as an event of the body breaking, like glass breaking, but also like news breaking, breaking in a specific social scene. If universities and their systems and structures like classes or Sawyer seminars demand, as Berlant puts it, that we closet our suffering at work, show no weakness, be models of bravery, if aversion to TMI is the rule in what Berlant calls vicious bureaucracies and caustic health economies, then writers like Boyer, Berlant writes, reverse and revenge. Now that kind of reversal and revenge has been the basic move of disability memoir from the 1970s on in the US. TMI has been its MO, in the service of undoing damage, in the service of an expansive flourishing. Take Cheryl Mareed's classic, I Am Not One of the. It's not a memoir, actually, it's a poem. I Am Not One of the is the name of this poem. This is a staple of US disability culture. It's a manifesto issued in 1987, and it braids together a string of repudiations. I've been forever, I'll be here forever. I'm the gimp, I'm the cripple, I'm the crazy lady, I'm the woman with juice. And yet these days, suffering as an event of the body breaking, seems to be breaking in a somewhat different social scene. Memoir writers these days sometimes explicitly stage and market themselves as post-disability studies or post the conventional disability movement. Take Christina Crosby's presentation of her recent body of work. Crosby, I think probably some people in the room may know her work, and she's written a wonderful memoir. She's an English professor who became paralyzed as the result of a cycling accident when she was 50 years old. And this is the lead paragraph on her webpage. My current work focuses on grief and the work of mourning, especially in relation to disability studies. In disability studies, anomalous bodies and so-called disabilities are rightly considered welcome variants of human potentiality, rather than regrettable incapacities or injuries to be cured. But there are real losses, nonetheless, that must imperatively be addressed so as to enrich our understanding of human possibility. Or to take another example, here from another piece, she writes, I couldn't agree more with the foundational arguments of disability studies but that's not the whole story. Listen for that line as I continue, that kind of move. I believe that keeping pain of body and of mind to ourselves makes it corrosive. And in yet another essay, I'm not surprised that so little writing in disability studies concentrates on pain or mourning. These are affective states that return attention to an individual body-mind, which contravenes the basic premise of the field. Your pain is invisible and intangible to others, hard to describe, hard to manage. The knowledge produced by the pain chart makes you a single datum incapable of leveraging a broader understanding of the phenomenon. Even if universal design should magically appear everywhere and signal a sea change in public understanding of what it means to be disabled, that fact would not touch the neurological pain lighting up my body, or my balky balls that move only when highly disciplined with laxatives and enemas, or counteract the loss of endless bodily pleasures. Now that's a true and a necessary and a right and a righteous critique. But when I read it, I sense in it a denial of great swaths of disability studies work that came before. For instance, when I read Crosby's invocation of a New Yorker review of her memoir, the line you see bolded here, the book asks readers to recognize how messy, precarious, and queer in every sense of the word life in a body can be. I hearken back to a moment in disability studies in the work again of Cheryl Marie Wade in 1997. This wasn't a marginal or an obscure moment, it was fundamental. To use Crosby's words, it was a foundational argument. This is Cheryl Marie Wade. To me, what it all gets down to is bodily fluids. Okay, that's a tad flippant, but I really do think it's an important part of the story. Nature at its most unruly, our very human essence is so damned undignified and so uncontrollable. We spend most of our life working like fiends to maintain the illusion that we are in control, that we can tame and tidy nature. Let's face it, nature always has the last laugh. Nowhere does the old girl laugh louder than with disability and death. God forbid we human beings should ever have to get up close and personal with our unwieldy, messy, smelly humanness. In every way possible, this culture's rules and values distance us from the realities of our own bodies in all their glorious imperfection. To put it bluntly, because this need is as blunt as it gets, we must have our asses cleaned after we shit and pee, or we have others' fingers inserted into our rectums to assist shitting, or we have tubes of plastic inserted inside us to assist peeing, or we have rerouted anuses and pissers, so we do it all into bags attached to our bodies. These blunt, crude realities, our daily lives, if we are ever to be really at home in the world and in ourselves, then we must say these things out loud, and we must say them with real language. Now, it's true that since the 1990s, like much postmodern theory, as Bill Hughes has recently argued, disability studies had a strong tradition of investment in a certain kind of leaky body, to use Margaret Shildrick's influential 1997 phrase. A leaky body which is fluid, messy, in violation of the taboos of civilizing modernity, yes, but as Hughes put it, approvingly, leakiness is water without the agony, mess and waste and unruliness without suffering. But other disability theorists not only took agony on, they took agony in. Take British disability activist theorist Liz Crow. She's now a famous actress in England. Do you know the show she's on? Anybody watch it? It's like a British detective show. So this was back in 1996, when instead of doing that, she was writing disability theory. So she was using the theoretical language of impairment. Does everybody know that history? There's a basic, fundamental, early distinction in the disability movement and disability studies between impairment and disability. So it's often represented with a fist and a hand. Like if this fist is a person, And the hand is everything else, the entire social surround, built environment, culture, society. Classic medical approaches to disability would be to try to get the fist to figure out how to fit into the hand. And the basic fundamental first move was to look at the hand instead. Say, how do you work that hand so it wraps around that fist? In that model, impairment would be the thing that some individual body has that limits it in some way, and disability is the hand. It's the social world that causes the difficulty. So Liz Crow, talking back to that, back in 1996, talking about the difficult aspects of what she calls impairment. Many of us remain frustrated and disheartened by pain, fatigue, depression, and chronic illness, including the way they prevent us from realizing our potential or railing fully against our experience of exclusion and discrimination. And then this ongoing list of things many of us fear, futures where more impairments happen. Many of us mourn things. Many of us are afraid we're going to die early, or that suicide may seem our only option. Many of us desperately seek effective medical intervention. Many of us feel ambivalent about the possibilities of our children having impairments, et cetera. So she was pushing back against what she called the silence about impairment. But in the disability studies I was learning at that time and took to heart, that pushback couldn't be, and it wasn't, ignored. So take, for instance, the great American disability theorist Tobin Siebers, writing in 2001. The greatest stake in disability studies at the present moment is to find ways to represent pain and to resist current models that blunt the political effectiveness of these representations. I stress the importance of pain, not because pain and disability are synonymous, but to offer a challenge to current body theory. Pain hovers over innumerable daily activities, whether the disability is painful in itself or only the occasion for pain because of the difficulty of navigating one's environment. The great challenge every day is to manage the body's pain, to get out of bed in the morning, to overcome that well of pain that rises in the evening. I'm sure so many people in this room, nobody's talking about. To meet the 100 daily obstacles that are not merely inconveniences, but occasions for physical suffering, and those italics are mine. So again, these were canonical figures in disability studies. I've come to think that this canonical strain of disability studies has itself become a kind of TMI that's had to be closeted, a kind of mess and real loss that has to be really lost in the new corpus of post-disability studies. I'm thinking another example of the equation of disability studies with a caricatured pride parade. Again, I'll take Christina Crosby as my first example. This is at the end of a 2017 essay, and there's been this ongoing metaphor of a parade. Unlike queer critique, in which Crosby finds the understanding, quote, that unseemly feelings affect body and mind together, disability studies for Crosby clings to its old pride parade. And here's the quotation. There is a drumming relentlessness in the call to pride, and I imagine there are others who don't feel addressed. Now I want to compare another moment in which a post-disability studies theorist rains on or rolls down like a mighty stream on disability studies as pride parade. This one is in a really important book, Jasper Puar's The Right to Maim. Puar begins her book with a memory of being in New York in the summer of 2014, and she's literally standing in between two masses of people. Two marches taking place simultaneously in New York City. A Black Lives Matter protest at Times Square, and a disability pride parade concluding at Madison Square Park. And here again, we have a moment of confounding. Puar writes, the relationship between the two confounded me. And then she asks, what kinds of biopolitical fissures produce a spectacle of disability empowerment and pride mere blocks from a movement protesting the targeted debilitation of an entire racialized population, contesting the production of disability that is central to state securitization practices. That is the maiming, the killing, the blinding, the torturing of black people by the police and by other state mechanisms. Now, the issues at stake here absolutely intersect, and Puar makes that clear, but her account of those points of intersection is uneven. So the Black Disabled Lives Matter contingent at the Pride Parade, as she describes it, is greeted with puzzlement by a crowd, quote, completely mystified as to why we would be in the march. So the mystified crowd at the Disability Pride Parade can't figure out what the Black Disabled Lives Matter presence is doing there. Black Lives Matter is in turn challenged by the Harriet Tubman Collective, a collective of Black, deaf, and Black disabled organizers, for its failure to include discussion about the impact of disability in Black communities in its platform. But Puar states that clearly, but the broader paragraph in which that statement occurs is framed this way. For its part, Black Lives Matter has been clear that people with disabilities are both survivors of injustice and part of their assembly. So claiming the term debilitation, distinct from the term disablement, because debility, quote, foregrounds the slow wearing down of populations instead of an event of becoming disabled, like Christina Crosby's bike accident. Puar argues that what counts as a disability, what is on display at the Great Relentless Disability Pride Parade, you can see this in bold here, is already overdetermined by white fragility on one side and the racialization of bodies that are expected to endure pain, suffering, and injury on the other. As such, the latter is an understanding of biopolitical risk. To extrapolate a bit from Claudia Rankine's prose, I am in death's position. And to expand, I am in debility's position. Debility's position, unlike disabilities, is and confronts systemic suffering. And this moment here at the beginning, I call myself disabled, is not an autobiographical authorial voice. It comes as, it's an imagined moment of identification. You'll note there too, there's another, this can't be the end of the story moment here. Now this is a true and a necessary and right and a righteous critique. It's very important. But like Puar standing in the middle of the two marches in New York City, I find myself confounded by the relation of debility to disability. I've thought a lot about how both terms are mobilized. In the great final section of Puar's book, The Right to Maim, so that section focuses with intensity on the deliberate and systematic production of debilitation, or in the word of the title, on the maiming of Palestinians by Israel. In a section called Disability in the West Bank, Puar argues that Palestinians are the debilitated bodies in contrast to the rehabilitated bodies of Israelis projected by the Israeli state. She treats a bunch of organizations, NGOs, that do various kinds of what she calls integration and empowerment programs for disabled people in Palestine. And what she stresses is how minimal and banal and constrained those measures are in a situation where the entire Palestinian West Bank population is disabled through the restriction of mobility. Now, there are moments in Puar's book that recognize queer organizing that's also anti-occupation organizing, that's also queer organizing. But there are no equivalent moments that recognize the existence of political platforms where disability organizing is also anti-occupation organizing, that is also disability organizing. I think actually they can exist in Puar's model, in this book at least, where disability always equals some combination of liberal rights seeking, depoliticization, and the denial of suffering. Puah writes that today the solidarity pathways between Black Lives Matter and Free Palestine are rhizomatic and bountiful. But there's no mention of rhizomatic opening pathways between any disability movement in the US or elsewhere and Free Palestine, and yet they exist. Reading this section of Puah's book, for instance, I thought about the work of Palestinian architect and college teacher Schweik W. Mari at the same time, 2013, 2014, that Puah locates as the moment her project originated. Mari shares to the core an unsparing commitment to the truth about the maiming and the debilitation of and the suffering inflicted on the Palestinian people that Puah places at the center of her book. This is a page from Mari's piece that I'm quoting here. So that photo is included in a piece that's called Reimagining the Teaching of Architecture, a Palestinian Perspective. Before the piece begins, he adds a little preface, and this is what he says. This chapter was originally titled Teaching Social Architecture in a Time of War. The author faces a series of hurdles in attempting to integrate the precepts of the social art of architecture into a curriculum molded in large part by forces outside of the control of university and faculty. The surprising successes reported in this case study provide inspiration that the goal of a more people-centered architecture is both universal and transcends even armed conflict. It is possible that, in fact, this very unique set of circumstances actually enhances the motivation to create a new paradigm for design. Those are his italics. The final chosen title reflects in a small way the hope for a more stable future through the everyday work of academic research. We might say that Mari was using his work with his students to engage in a kind of suffering well. Mari was a young architecture teacher in Palestine. He was also working closely with a man who wrote what I would argue was the first disability studies book ever published, my colleague Ray Lifshay in the US, whose Design for Independent Living was published in 1980. Lifshay and Mari's work together aimed to create a solidarity pathway between the disability movement and places like the West Bank and struggles like Free Palestine. Mari and his students actually imagined literal pathways of sorts in Ramallah. In the colonized space that is Palestine, Mari writes, I experienced architecture as a tool and subject of violence, colonization, and control. With his students, he was aiming for something different. For the culminating project, students drafted plans and built models, and I want to stress they were just only models, for disability accessible, universally designed building space grounded in traditional Palestinian cultural forms, an inclusive library that would be inviting to the people of the city. This is one picture of one of the student groups working on this library project, the model of the library. Located in the center of Ramallah, the library connected two streets via a pathway that passes through it. Their idea was that it would invite people to have a coffee and read a book in its patios, or just sit around in the garden and enjoy the free e-book service. The imagined library linked two busy streets with an open corridor that the two streets couldn't be gotten to by people who used wheelchairs or who had limited mobility. So the idea was to make it possible for people to move in that direction. And then in another plan, the idea was to have a radio channel broadcast audiobooks to a wide geographic area. And the issue wasn't just suffering well, it was also struggling well. Mari's universal design teaching became the model. It was intended all along to be the model for a wider project across Birzeit University the next year titled The Architecture of Resistance. That's my disability studies. When suffering gets engaged, disability studies and what's called the disability rights movement often get dissed. But suffering was there at the conceptual start. I already called Ray Lifshay's book arguably the first academic book in disability studies. It was his 1980 Design for Independent Living. Arguably the first writing at all that spearheaded and jump-started the Western marked disability rights movement that shaped disability studies came from a man named Paul Hunt in 1966. Hunt was living in a nursing home. He'd been put there against his will at age 19 in a nursing home with old people. And with Vic Finkelstein, from that position, it's hard to imagine a more, well, no it isn't, but it is a very shut-in, segregated position. He co-founded UPIAS, the Union for the Physically Impaired Against Segregation, which formulated the basic principles of what gets called the social model of disability. This really is the mothership for disability studies, conventional disability studies, and it's freighted with the idea of suffering. For Hunt, suffering was virtuous. And I just want to point you to this whole forum that was conducted in Amsterdam. Is it in Amsterdam? In Holland. At Leiden University, New Perspectives on the Ethics of Suffering for Critical Global Health and Justice. And a lot of the emphasis in that forum is on the idea of virtuous suffering. Hunt absolutely had that idea. He accorded a productive value to disabled suffering, a strength that was both devalued. Again, he's locked inside the back room of a nursing home for life, and also disruptive. Disability was for Hunt, in the brilliant title of his great 1966 essay, A Critical Condition. The essay appeared in an anthology Hunt edited in 1966 as a reversal of and revenge of sorts on Irving Goffman's famous book, Stigma, which was published 3 years earlier. Goffman's book began with the figure of the stigma, the kind of etymological origin of the word, as a visible mark on the body. In the final essay in Paul Hunt's Stigma, he revised that figure of the stigma as a mark. This is what he wrote. I think the distinguishing mark of disabled people's social position is that they tend to challenge in their relations with ordinary society. And then he made this list of all the ways that that might happen. They challenged intellectually, politically, spiritually, ethically, in 5 ways. First, by being useless, and thereby challenging the idea that work, in the everyday sense of the word work, is the most important contribution anyone can make. And he has, by the way, just go read this essay, a very queer-friendly analysis of gender in there, in that part. Challenged by being different, and thereby challenging the goal and principle of normality. And there, from his isolated place in that institution, he made quite strong links to race and class as well. Challenged by being oppressed and by meeting oppression, by being unfortunate and thereby challenging the belief that a person's worth depends upon their good fortune, and finally, not least, by being sick. And what he said that did was, it revealed very clearly to people every day what unwelcome reality actually is. So for all you wonderful, or we, who are being unfortunates, being useless, being oppressed, being different, being sick, here's a little of Hunt's great treatise on suffering. The linkage with other unfortunates with the shadow side of life is not always easy to accept. For the disabled person with a fair intelligence and other gifts, perhaps the greatest temptation is to try to use them just to escape from his disabledness, to buy himself a place in the sun, a share in the illusory normal world, where all is light and pleasure and happiness. Naturally, we want to get away from and forget the sickness, depression, pain, loneliness, and poverty, of which we probably see more than our share. But if we deny our special relation to the dark in this way, we shall have ceased to recognize the most important asset of disabled people in society, the uncomfortable subversive position from which we act as a living reproach to any scale of values, that puts attributes or possessions before the person. So what if we think of the disability studies Paul Hunt started not as suffering avoidance, but as a theoretical engagement with suffering well? What I'm arguing, what I want to underscore, is that for decades, both the disability movement and the academic field called disability studies that emerged out of that movement have had persistent and powerful bleak strains. And I'm using bleak in Victorian literary theorist Amanda Anderson's sense of that word, invoking her book, Bleak Liberalism. And I want to thank my coworker, Kent Puckett, who really is the person who made me go read that book. Anderson's history shows very compellingly that a liberal tradition that acknowledges, and these are her words, transpersonal or impersonal forms and practices that make their force felt. So a liberal tradition that doesn't just focus, as we might often think liberalism would, on individual self-actualization, that familiar idea of the liberal. This other strand has been there all along. She shows us a liberalism fully engaged with, and these are her words, violence and suffering, both natural and social. I'm arguing that both the disability rights movement and disability studies, they're absolutely best understood as liberal endeavors. But they engaged in what Anderson calls liberalism as a philosophical and political project conceived in an acute awareness of the challenges and often bleak prospects confronting it. A sentence that could speak to much of our current situation. I'm arguing for the long existence of, in Anderson's terms, a bleak disability studies. But whose bleak disability studies am I talking about? Hunt spoke of a situation or a movement with a special relation to the dark, metaphorical dark. Etymologically, bleak comes from the Old Norse for white. Is this bleak disability studies I'm tracing white disability studies? Now, on the one hand, no, as my invocation, for instance, of Faik W. Mari suggests, but also yes. Sometimes the history of engagement with disability studies with what Jasbir-Puar calls the racialization of bodies that are expected to endure pain, suffering, and injury all but disappears. So just very quickly give you one more example. There's a very interesting, quite new book by an ethnographer named Lawrence Ralph, who went and hung out with paralyzed ex-gang members in Chicago. And he's very explicit about how the situation of these men has not ever been taken up by disability studies. It's kind of unrecognizable to disability studies. So this is from his book, Renegade Dreams, Living Through Injury in Gangland, Chicago. In striving to mitigate the biases against those with physical and mental impairments, scholars of physical impairment have glossed over the way that race operates within disabled communities. And then he talks about this one man who he calls Justin, who he says reveals the perils of such an omission. Justin's wheelchair-bound life. And I'll tell you, he is using fighting words when he goes right to the wheelchair-bound phrase, which has been pretty thoroughly rejected by disability activists. And if you don't kind of intuitively get why, we could talk about that. He's very consciously using it to stress the bind that Justin is in. Justin's wheelchair-bound life and the ways he makes sense of his disability would be nearly unrecognizable, not to mention incomprehensible, to, for example, a well-off white middle-class person who's paralyzed in a car crash. And then he takes Arthur Frank as his model for disability studies. Paralyzed ex-gang members in Chicago do not subscribe to Arthur Frank's thesis that medical treatment facilities mute the injured patient's voice. Now, he goes on, he has a really amazing account. I recommend this book of the Crippled Footprint Collective formed by a bunch of ex-gang members who are themselves the victims of violence, who go into Chicago schools to do violence prevention programs. But here's what I find confounding about this. I truly do not understand this. He writes that disability studies has glossed over the issues he's talking about. He doesn't give any sign of even knowing about, I guess, a program so close to the home of his study that its omission is inexplicable to me and irresponsible and maybe inexcusable. So right there in Chicago, at the same time he was doing the research, within the University of Chicago's Disability Studies Department, which is the flagship PhD in the field, there was going on, and had been going on for many years, a community organizing peer mentoring project in which former gang members with violently acquired spinal cord injuries coached and mentored other men injured in the same way, giving, in particular, support in how to navigate this new world, things like how to deal with bureaucrats at folk rehab, things like that. The PI for the funding for that project was Latinx disability studies scholar Fabricio Balcazar, whose work extends globally and has really focused consistently on disability, poverty, and Black and Indigenous and people of color. In other words, he was extremely far from glossing over how race operates within disabled communities. And what's really weird about this is that there's another anthropologist who had made a film about it, this project before, and a more recent one later, called The Disabling Bullet Revisited. This film is by Patrick Devliger, and you can find it online on YouTube. It's kind of interesting. He goes back to his much older film and then gathers a new set of people to watch the film and films them commenting on it while he watches it, and that's online. And I think it'd be very interesting for you privately or in a class, say, to read Lawrence Ralph's book, or some of it, side by side with something like The Disabling Bullet, to try to get at what exactly is going on that makes Ralph so strongly separate himself from this work. If he knew about it at all, I don't understand how he couldn't have. Because he cites the filmmaker Patrick Devliger in footnotes, always in every presentation of this work. Just kind of the name. So he clearly has some sense that it exists. And that's maybe forgetfulness, or maybe that kind of thing we all recognize where a scholar, in order to put forward their own claim, kind of clears everybody else's side, right? We've all seen that. Except that this is such a consistent pattern in the treatment of this field. But I need to underscore another typical pattern, and this is my final turn. Is this bleak disability studies I'm tracing white disability studies? There are plenty of answers that could suggest yes. I won't read it. This is an awful review in Disability Studies Quarterly in 1999 of The Disabling Bullet, and its utter cluelessness, and it's totally awful. The target population, no pun intended. That's bleak, all right. And reading that kind of thing, I understand exactly why Lawrence Ralph or Jasper Puar would turn away from disability studies. Disability studies has barely begun to suffer well in many ways, but we're going to have to learn fast. When I thought about this topic that was set for me, first text that came to mind was an essay by the wonderful rabbi and disability studies scholar Julia Watts-Belzer, Disability and the Social Politics of Natural Disaster. And I'm not going to read this all to you, but I just invite you to write it. She's meditating on disabled people, among other people, are just naturally vulnerable in situations of disaster. And that idea obscures, as she puts it, the political significance of structural inequalities that render people with disabilities more at risk. And she calls for a constructive, redemptive storytelling to counter that. And nothing about that constructive, redemptive storytelling means turning away from the problem of suffering. In fact, it means turning right toward it. My final move. There's a famous slogan in US disability culture since disability activists organized in 1996 in response to Jack Kevorkian, Dr. Death, who was euthanizing disabled people. There's a movement against assisted suicide on the grounds that it was in the society that we live in the economic structures that we live under, that it was impossible to have a sufficiently protected and safe model of assisted suicide for disabled people. Not dead yet. So I wonder if any of you have heard that phrase in any other context?
Yep.
That's right. It is in Monty Python, the Holy Grail. And to go as far in the other direction towards suffering as I can go, I will give you one more example of where it occurs. It's occurred actually in a lot of places, but one has resonated for a very long time, but it's never been recognized, as far as I know, as a part of disability history. Although it gets an extraordinary account in work by another person from my department. I can't recommend this essay highly enough. It's about to come out, Kathleen Donegan's The Gully, which is going to make the history of this not dead yet indelible, I think. But there too, it isn't treated as part of disability history. So it got recorded in a song of suffering and resistance sung by enslaved people for generations, starting in Jamaica, from a plantation there owned by a man named George Bedward. It started from what should be a foundational place for disability studies, as foundational as Paul Hunt's nursing home. It started from a hole in the ground. In that gully, hence Kathleen's title, The Gully, in that gully on the Spring Garden plantation in the late 18th century, Bedford ordered enslaved people who were thought to be too sick to work to be left to die in that hole. The enslaved people who witnessed that and survived it made a song about it, given beautiful account by Kathleen Donegan. And by the 19th century, it was called the famous Negro Song of Jamaica. And it had two repeating lines, one spoken by the slave master, "Take him to the gully," and the other, the line that carries, "Oh, me no dead yet." Both those histories of the cry, not dead yet, echoed this past week in the life and death organizing being done by disabled and fat and queer activists, led by poor Black people of color in the movement that's calling itself Power to Live. I'll wait a minute. Here's what Power to Live activist Stacey Milburn had to say about it. Just today, this statement was issued. Folks who have been working deeply on climate issues are fighting for utility justice in California, including looking at democratizing PG&E so the executives who sparked fires and shut off power for 1 million people without a plan aren't able to continue putting shareholder profits over people's lives and the land. Advocates are saying there may be enough public and governmental momentum to create a shift right now. Fingers crossed. What else is going on while people are galvanizing for a fight? PG&E is using their relationship with disability nonprofits to deflect responsibility and to create legitimacy when there is reason for none. This strategy is right out of a PR handbook. PG&E having contracts with local nonprofits doesn't change that the utility is fundamentally broken and unable to meet the needs of the community. How is 10 batteries, that's what they offered in my area, how is 10 batteries going to serve 1,750 homes dependent on Power to Live anyways? Power to Live meaning people who had used medical equipment or mobility equipment that requires power. It is common for institutions to use the safety of disabled people and seniors. Just look at past denial of overtime pay protection for domestic workers, support for police expansion, and destruction of curbside communities in the name of sidewalk accessibility as a few examples of incredibly important concept, access washing. Be vigilant. We can't let PG&E use our people as a weapon in their arsenal. They win when we are single issue in our politics and not working across movements. They win when we are not in alignment with each other. This is so much more than batteries. So that's Stacey Milburn of the Disability Justice Culture Club. Again, I recommend going to their website and checking it out. That's suffering as an event of the body breaking, like glass breaking, but also like news breaking. And I hope you'll take Stacey's words with you. Okay, that's it. Thanks for sitting through that. Yeah, thank you. And I have thought about it. It's really what I'm getting at. And I've been thinking a lot about how in the academic world that I spend my days in, there is, to some extent, a real resurgence of attention, say, to 1980s women of color feminism, or 1960s Asian American movement politics. You know, I see more and more this wonderful effort to go back and really begin to rethink and reclaim and resort through what those histories mean. And I don't see it here at all. Disability studies has always, you could argue, zoomed ahead, but more pressingly lagged behind the attention of other identity claims in the academy, right? To a significant extent, I think disability studies only became really of interest in the academy when it met up with queer theory, and then it took off, almost on the coattails. But it's a significant problem, and I think it does have to do with the fear, with a combination of affective dynamics, fear, disgust, pity, that cluster so strongly around our actual bodies and minds, and body minds. It was such a dysmorphic culture. And it's just striking to me. I could give so many examples of it. Just to take one really odd one. Recent book got a lot of positive press by Obasi Obasogie, law professor. It's on color blindness. It's on a really important topic. It's a work of legal studies. Anybody know this book? It's on the ideology of color blindness in legal rulings up to the Supreme Court that have to do with race in the US and the danger of the idea of color blindness. So he got this idea, African American man, not a blind man. He got this idea, I'm going to go and interview blind people, and I'm going to do that in order to talk about the pernicious idea of color blindness. And the book, I'm parroting it, but not that much. It sets itself up as, you might have thought that blind people don't see race because they can't see, they're blind. But I went and interviewed a bunch of blind people, and you wouldn't believe it, they actually have an understanding of race. And this shows how ludicrous the formulation of color blindness is. And there are many things about that don't make much sense. And the particular way he did it was really problematic. He says, how did I find my subjects? I couldn't ask anyone who worked in any field related to blindness because that would sully. So I just did this. I found a blind person, and I asked that blind person if they knew other blind people, and I did a snowball collection of people to interview. And what's very odd to me about this, he also has, it's a very standard moment. I tend to go right for it, but it's standard enough. He says, disability studies hasn't said anything about race, so I don't have to talk about that, thereby excluding a not large but very interesting and significant body of writing by Black blind poets, performance artists, scholars. But he says, I couldn't mess up the purity of my sample by going and interviewing anyone who studied blindness. But then the whole appendix of the book is an appendix on critical race theory. So that book can fully, there's something about, it wasn't going to mess around with his methodology to do that, but it could not, literally could not embrace in any way anything to do with disability. That kind of, sometimes it really is inexplicable to me. It seems so irresponsible. But more often, I think it's overtly, it's patronizing. There's a patronization that the claims and experiences of disabled people, or more broadly, the experiences of disability, the complex experiences of our actual bodies, there's a very quick move to patronize them. So I'll just give one more example. Julian Carter's fantastic book on normal. What's it called? The End of Normal, maybe? There's a moment in there where Julian quotes this amazing quotation from Eve Sedgwick. And I remember it because she has a phrase, I think it's, we have such puny axes to parse out our identities. She says gender, race, class, sexuality. I think that's the phrase. And I remember it because when I first read it, I thought it was axes, puny axes. So it's always stuck in my head. But then Julian adds, and he says, religious scholars have now added religion into the mix. And then there's this odd little phrase. It's like, and disability studies are trying their best, scholars are trying their best to get disability studies added as well. What is that? It just is this kind of quick patronization that, again, I think must extend from our cultural, our social pity and fear and disgust. And Bill Hughes, in the article I cited there, adds another term, which he says, rightly so, is really on the rise. Pity, fear, disgust, and hate. Probably number one right at the moment. Yeah, well, two things come to mind right away. One is that, as Amanda Anderson points out in that book, we tend to confuse liberalism and neoliberalism. We are all in the clutches of neoliberalism, but some people are more than others, and disabled people are in that gully, that hole of neoliberalism in so many ways. There's a way in which discussions of disability so often so quickly go to money and expense. You see it in the academy. Discussions of accommodation, how much everything's going to cost. So that's point one. Point two is, this just has to do with the function of ableism. I think that there is very little tradition. Be wrong about this, but I don't think so. There's very little tradition that associates disabled people, with the notable exception of psychiatric disability, with power in any way. And given that there's very little ability to recognize a radical disability tradition. Now, many of the movements I'm talking about now, the disability justice movement, especially, which founds itself really powerfully, I'll say, and wisely, in that same distinction that has been made around reproductive issues, for instance. So we're not talking about reproductive rights, we're talking about reproductive justice, okay? The repudiation of rights talk. It is such an important move. But there's very little recognition in the broader culture of the capacity of that move to be made around disability, of the disability justice movement, which, again, I saw at work in the last 2 weeks in my neck of the woods, where people literally would have died if disabled people of color hadn't organized mutual aid systems. And it was one of the most exciting things I've ever seen in my life, and very sustaining under really frightening circumstances. Like really young climate justice activists teaming up with disability activists and going to people's houses and building air purifiers out of box fans and sealing up windows and doors so that people could survive the combination of no power and the smoke that was coming in. So that, I think it's very difficult to recognize radical disability movement. I also think that the liberal disability rights movement is all too threatening in and of itself, discomfits. And where other kinds of gains and achievements and like relative gains and relative achievements that have been won through the law and the courts and through systems of policy are taken for granted largely. There's very little about any of those achievements where disability is concerned that is taken for granted. I'm sure many people in this room know that if you're fighting for access, it's a real struggle. And there's a really clear invitation to not do it at all, right? To just deal as best you can. It's always been a particularly abstract term, a term like disability. It's born out of policy, it comes out of policy, it doesn't exist as some kind of already existing term that people would bandy about to name somebody. You know, they would say blind or whatever. You know, on the one hand, I think you can see, say with gender, for instance, that in fact what looked like a kind of easily recognizable term comes to seem like it's large, it contains multitudes, right? But not like this. Disability has always been a coalitional term. The disability movement has always been, by definition, a coalitional movement, sometimes threatened by smaller movements. In the realm of liberal rights-seeking, for instance, the history of blind groups getting lots of stuff that no one else got, and really over other people's backs too. But also just out of a kind of radical sense of, you know, this is us, we represent us. But it's an ongoing struggle. And one of the things I think that's really interesting that's related to, it chimes in my mind with, say, Christina Crosby's memoir, and that kind of move is a move in writing, a move in memoir in particular maybe, or in poetry and other things, towards that kind of particularity of bodily experience. And there are certain bizarre strains in the history of the disability movement that attempted to kind of forbid that. Like, it became a kind of British-American divide, so Americans this is what we do in this country, right? Wrote things that seemed too individual about their individual bodies, and would get scolding rebukes from people in British disability studies because you were just supposed to identify yourself as disabled. You weren't supposed to go into any detail because it was in the name of a coalitional movement that was addressing, it was traveling off people's bodies. The issue wasn't any individual person's body. And so that this move to reclaim that intractable, singular experience has tremendous power. And then the question is how you build a movement out of very different things. And again, the disability justice movement is doing something that the disability rights movement also did for a long time, but doing it in a very compelling way, foregrounding things like competing accommodations. Two people in the room might need access and they can't both get it because one accommodation will cancel the other one out. Like, I need a lot of light in this room so that I can see the ASL interpreter, but that light is fluorescent and I'm going to have a migraine, if that kind of thing. And it's one of the things that fascinates me about the whole issue of access, because it's always mediated and negotiated. And so in some ways, I think the category, the movement that places itself in relation to that category becomes a model for certain kinds of coalitional negotiation and thinking about difference, but also having a collective intention. But it's just a fascinating question. It's a brutal list, you know, like we're useless, we can't work, I can't remember the whole list off the top of my head, but it couldn't be starker. And of course, not for people in Paul Hunt's position in 1966, because people in Paul Hunt's position ended up like Paul Hunt. They ended up shut away in one form or other without, I mean, it's breathtaking that he begins to publish and to organize politically from the position he's in. But of course, were many people who were disabled in 1966 in Parliament, being lawyers, having kids, you know, et cetera, living ordinary lives? Yeah. And so this is, of course, exactly the reason why the pushback against this kind of formulation, the pushback against any formulation that wouldn't say, we're here, get used to it, and say the same point that he was making, but differently. The point being, our society flourishes because there are disabled people in it, right? He's making that point, but there are much kind of easier ways to make that point. I think the radical suffering in that piece of his is one of the reasons why it's not better known, even though it does start extremely broad social phenomenon. There's something that is hard to take about that melancholy generalization also. You know, but I admire it a lot also, because the flip side is he's not trying to butter anybody up. You know, it's exactly like everything you're really scared of, think again. Right, thank you. I think so. And do you? I guess my first thought about this, I'm getting more and more impatient with model talk, period. It fascinates me that, like, we don't sit around all day when we're talking about Black history in this country, for instance, saying the race model or the whatever it would be, various intricate models. There's something really odd to me about how, I think it has to do with the power, the influence of the social model, right? But I don't know if you've read it, but I would really recommend this book by the Norwegian disability theorist and writer Jan Gru, who has an amazing book on models, just about the way this field organized itself around models. That said, I agree that I think the critique is really about the social model. If we need to talk about the social model, it has always struck me how inflexibly people take the principle. Like, sometimes I've set myself, when this discussion occurs, the social model doesn't take into account pain or fatigue or whatever. The moment in Christina Crosby where she says, it can't help me when that amazing line, I don't remember, but where my nerves light up. What's always struck me is, well, I don't know. I think there are a lot of ways thinking socially about that would be of use. Like, it seems perfectly reasonable to think of talking about how much medication costs as a social issue, to think about the question of who gets believed when they talk about their pain and who doesn't as a social issue. To get at over-medication as a social problem, on and on and on. It seems to me that I haven't yet encountered an issue that I couldn't pose a thought experiment where I would say, well, I can think about that in terms of social distribution of resources and power, or arrangements of space or whatever. Some are harder to do than others, but I can't think of one. I'm interested if anyone can. So I've never quite understood. I think a lot of that actually has to do with the flip side of the other term in the social model, which is impairment, which is, I think, a really confusing term for many reasons, because of the stress on limitation alone in it. Because it's understood as not social, even though anthropologists, for instance, would tell us that all things about the body are social. So I think a lot of it is actually impairment trouble rather than trouble with the idea of the social.